What exactly did Messiah Yeshua mean when he said, "For many are called, but few are chosen"? The context is Yeshua's parable of a king who made a wedding feast for his son, but had trouble getting the invited guests to attend. In Matthew's account of the parable, the king sent servants to call the guests to the feast, but they didn't respond to the call. Some probably ignored the servants, and some may have promised to come, but got distracted and forgot. Some of the people rudely refused the invitation and mistreated the servants, either because they were too busy to be bothered with the king's summons, or they failed to recognize that it was a genuine call from the king. All of these people may have had good intentions and thought they were doing the right thing. After all, they were invited guests, and they likely considered themselves among the privileged few who enjoyed the king's favor. What a surprise, then, when they saw the king's army invade their city, burn it to the ground, and kill the rebels among them. We don't have time to absorb that bit of the story before Yeshua goes on to say that the king sent his servants to find others to come and fill the vacant seats at the wedding feast. Everyone was invited, both the good and the bad, and the wedding hall was filled to capacity. Then this happened. But when the king came in to look over the guests, he saw a man there who wasn't dressed in wedding clothes. "Friend," he said to him, "how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" But the man was silent. Then the king said to his servants, "Tie him up hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen." This should be a scary parable. It should motivate us to prayer and self-examination to discern whether we might be among those invited guests who snubbed the king's servants when the call came to attend the feast. What often happens, though, is that we shake our heads at the poor people who got disinvited because they obviously weren't among our select group. Well, that could be a fatal error. It was for many of the Hebrews who should have come out of Egypt with Moses. The connection of Yeshua's parable with Israel's exodus from Egypt is in Yeshua's introduction to the story. Yeshua answered and spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who made a wedding feast for his son." This is a kingdom parable. The kingdom is always the connection. God's kingdom has existed for eternity. The history of the earth is the story of him extending his kingdom to this realm. He has always invited his human creations to join him in celebrating his creation. We Christians refer to that celebration as the wedding feast of the Lamb. But that's only one of the names it can be called. In Yeshua's story, the wedding feast is held for the king's son, whom we assume to be Messiah Yeshua himself. Well, that also is one way to look at it. But as usual, there's more to the story. We get a hint of that in Hosea's prophecy. "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Well, that prophecy does refer to Yeshua coming out of Egypt as an infant after his family fled the tyranny of King Herod. But the reason it makes sense in that context is because God established the original context of calling his chosen nation of Israel out of Egypt. Israel is the nation filled with his sons and daughters. That's why everyone who is redeemed by the blood of the Lamb has a place in the commonwealth of Israel. We get caught up in thinking this is a Christian and Jewish thing, which it is, in a sense. What may be more useful, however, is to start thinking of it as a redeemed humanity thing. Our Creator has always wanted to have His wedding hall filled with guests, but the invited guests have tended to drift away. That's why He has had to reissue the invitation to new guests in every generation. Oh, that doesn't mean all the original guests were removed from the list. Many are still there, having faithfully answered His call when it came. In the Bible, we know these people as Noah's family, Abraham's household, Jacob's sons, the tribes of Israel who followed Moses out of Egypt, along with the mixed multitude who joined them, and the Pharisees and Torah teachers who followed Yeshua, along with the Gentiles who joined them. At each step, there were many who found themselves disinvited or unchosen because of one thing or another. The Exodus story helps us understand why that is so. The Hebrews didn't just leave. They were thrust out of Egypt. That means Pharaoh had to compel them to go. And that indicates the people as a whole weren't ready to leave Egypt, even though God had opened the way. Egypt was home, after all, and maybe some of the Hebrews were thinking they at last had an opportunity to take over and restore Egypt to the way it had been when their ancestors were welcomed to the land. They had no concept of Canaan, the land of promise, and probably little desire to set out for the unknown when they could just as easily have rebuilt Egypt. And then there's the idolatry issue. The native Hebrews and the Egyptians and others who joined them had attachments to the gods of Egypt that distracted and diverted them from single-minded loyalty to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, God did redeem all of them, and all who answered His call walked out with Moses. But we learn later that many perished in the desert because they couldn't get over their divided loyalties. That's what hindered them from hearing and responding properly to the multiple calls from the king to attend his wedding feast. We're still dealing with that same problem. Like our Hebrew ancestors and the multitudes from the nations who have joined them in every generation, we have our King's invitation, but we don't always answer His call. It may be that we are thinking we're already at the feast rather than on the journey to it. It's not that we're hostile to His messengers, but we don't understand why they keep urging us to move on from what we think is the final destination. So we wander off into the desert, or find ourselves on the wrong end of judgment that removes the hard of hearing and hard of heart from the guest list. Does this mean we can lose our salvation? Well, that's not the question to ask. Ultimately, the King who invited all humanity to His wedding feast determines who gets in and who remains in the outer darkness. The question we should ask is whether we are ready to keep answering every time He calls.